My name is Lena Ahmed. At 36 years old, I had built what many would consider the perfect life. Living in Aberdeen, Scotland, I was a proud Muslim woman, deeply rooted in my faith. I had a flourishing career, a loving husband, Omar, and 3 beautiful children who filled my home with laughter and love. To the outside world, my life seemed flawless, everything in its right place. But beneath the surface, something was shifting within me. A quiet unease had begun to grow, whispering doubts that I could no longer ignore. For years, I had embraced my faith wholeheartedly. The rhythms of Islamic life were like a steady heartbeat. Prayer, fasting, giving, the sacred rituals that shaped every part of my day. But as the years passed, questions began to gnaw at me. It started with small doubts, like ripples in a still pond. I found myself wrestling with the concept of eternal punishment. The idea that a loving and merciful God would condemn someone to an eternity of suffering troubled me deeply. I questioned whether it was fair, whether it was truly in line with the compassionate nature of Islam that I had always been taught to believe in. But it didn't stop there. The treatment of women in Islam became another area of intense internal conflict. Growing up, I had been taught that Islam honored women, but as I looked around at the lives of those in my community, and even at my own life, I began to feel that the reality didn't always align with the ideals. I questioned why women seemed to be treated as second-class citizens in many ways, both within the religious framework and in society. Why were there so many contradictions? Why was there such a difference between what I had been taught and the experiences I was witnessing? These questions began to plague me in a way I couldn't shake. I would lie awake at night, staring at the ceiling, my mind swirling with uncertainty. Was I losing my faith, or was I simply trying to reconcile the parts of it that felt wrong? And more than that, I found myself wondering what would happen if I questioned everything I had been taught. What would I find at the end of this journey? Would I still recognize myself? Would I still have a place in the faith that had been my anchor for so long? As I grappled with these existential questions, little did I know that a single event would soon force me to confront the deepest aspects of my beliefs and perceptions, shaking my reality in ways I could never have anticipated. July 16th began like any other day. The sky was overcast, a dull gray that hung low over the city of Aberdeen, as I made my way to an important meeting I had been preparing for weeks. I remember the hum of the engine beneath me, the familiar clink of the gears shifting, the rhythm of my breath matching the rhythm of the road. My mind was on autopilot, thoughts scattered between the presentation I was about to give and the busy schedule that awaited me after. I had no idea that in just a matter of seconds, everything would change, and my reality would be shattered. It happened in an instant. One moment, I was driving along the road, absorbed in the ebb and flow of traffic, and the next, the world around me seemed to explode in a terrifying burst of noise and chaos. A loud crash reverberated through the air as debris, huge pieces of metal and shattered glass, tore through the space in front of me. My heart skipped a beat as my car was struck by a massive chunk of wreckage flung from a truck up ahead. Everything happened so fast, and yet, in that moment, time seemed to stretch out. My hands gripped the steering wheel instinctively, but there was nothing I could do. I was helpless. The car spun wildly out of control, screeching across the pavement as I felt the air around me turned to a thick, suffocating haze. Then, just like that, I was weightless. It was as though my body had become an irrelevant object, detached from everything happening below. I didn't know where I was or what had happened to me, but I could feel myself floating above the wreckage. My first thought was how surreal it felt. I was watching the scene unfold beneath me, as though I were a spectator to my own life, my physical self completely absent from the chaos below. The world looked distant, fuzzy, like an image in a dream, blurred and incomprehensible. I could see my car, crumpled and mangled, a twisted heap of metal that no longer resembled the vehicle I had been driving moments before. Smoke billowed from the engine, and shattered glass littered the road around me. Yet I felt no pain. There was no fear, no panic. Instead, a strange sense of calm washed over me. It was as though I were watching a movie, everything moving in slow motion. The violence of the crash turned into something distant and almost unimportant. But the most remarkable thing about that experience was the sensation of separation. It was as if I was no longer part of the scene, no longer attached to the broken body below. I could see myself, lying unconscious, blood trickling from my head, my eyes closed, my body slumped at an unnatural angle. But it was almost as if I were looking at someone else, a stranger. My body, my life, felt like a mere echo of the person I had once been. The version of me that was watching from above was detached, unburdened by the weight of flesh and bone. I wasn't in pain. I wasn't even scared. It was as if, for a fleeting moment, I had become something more than human, something beyond the confines of my physical form. The feeling was both peaceful and unsettling. I floated above the wreckage, hovering in an eerie silence. It wasn't like anything I had ever imagined. It was as though the world had slowed down just enough for me to observe it without the usual noise, distractions, or limitations. I wasn't tethered to my body, nor was I bound by time. In that suspended state, I felt free in a way that I couldn't explain. But with that freedom came a profound sense of isolation. It was as if I were completely alone in the world, distanced from everything and everyone I had ever known. As the sense of detachment began to dissolve, replaced by a warmth and peace I had never known, I found myself in the presence of something, or rather someone, that transcended everything I had believed about life, faith, and the nature of existence. It happened in a moment that felt both like an eternity and a fleeting instant, one of those rare experiences that alters the very fabric of who you are. I remember the light first. It was warm, almost like the sun on a soft summer afternoon, but it wasn't blinding. It was gentle and comforting, wrapping around me like a loving embrace. I had no idea what was happening, but I felt this profound peace settle over me, a peace that seemed to fill the very core of my being. The world, with all its noise and confusion, seemed to fade away, and all that was left was this overwhelming sense of love. And then I saw him. At first, I thought it was just a figure, someone I didn't recognize clearly. But as he stepped forward, there was no mistaking who it was. Jesus. But not the Jesus I had been taught about, the one I had read about in the Quran as the prophet Isa. No, this was different. This was the Lord, the one I had heard about but never truly understood, the Savior in a way I had never imagined. There was no doubt in my mind. The presence before me was divine. His eyes were kind, filled with compassion and understanding. They seemed to look right through me, as though he saw every part of my soul, the doubts, the fears, the questions I had been carrying for so long. There was no judgment, no condemnation, just love. A love so pure, so absolute, that I felt it wash over me, cleansing me from the inside out. I had never known anything like it. It was as if everything I had ever searched for, the answers, the peace, the comfort, was suddenly laid bare in front of me, and I understood, in that moment, what it truly meant to be loved by God. In that space, time seemed irrelevant. My mind, usually cluttered with 1,000 thoughts, was still, calm, focused solely on Him. He didn't speak in words at first. It was as if His presence itself conveyed the truth I had been searching for. I felt God's love, immeasurable, boundless, flowing through me. And for the first time in my life, I understood that love was not something to be earned or feared, but a gift freely given, regardless of who we are, where we come from, or what we've done. It was beyond anything I had ever imagined. Then, in a voice that was gentle yet filled with power, He spoke. I am the way, the truth, and the life. His words felt like a key turning inside me, unlocking doors I didn't even know were there. It wasn't a voice of condemnation, nor was it the voice of a stranger. It was the voice of someone who knew me deeply, who understood me completely. And in that moment, I felt the truth of what He was saying. Not just intellectually, but in the very marrow of my bones. The truth about salvation, about the love of God, about the grace that I had so long misunderstood. But the encounter with Jesus didn't end with peace alone. It opened the door to revelations that would challenge everything I thought I understood about faith and truth. As I stood there, enveloped in that warm, divine light, the presence of Jesus seemed to radiate an understanding far beyond anything I could grasp with my earthly mind. His love was overwhelming, but what came next left me shaken to my core. It wasn't a condemnation or a harsh judgment, but a revelation. He began to show me truths, unsettling truths, about the very foundation of Islam. Truths I had never imagined could exist. Truths that turned everything I had believed upside down. I had always revered Islam, had always considered it the path to God, the way of peace and righteousness. But in that moment, something shifted within me. Jesus showed me the origins of Islam, not as I had known them, but from a perspective I couldn't ignore. He revealed to me how dark forces, not of God, had been at work behind the scenes, subtly influencing the visions that Muhammad had received. The clarity of the revelation was stark. I felt as though the veil that had once separated me from the truth had been ripped away, and for the first time, I could see with unclouded eyes. These visions, which I had once accepted without question, were not what they seemed. There was manipulation, deceit, and hidden agendas woven into the very fabric of what I had believed to be divine inspiration. But it didn't stop there. The teachings of Islam, the pillars that had always been my guide, began to take on a new, darker meaning. The 5 pillars, prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, and faith, were not the pure expressions of devotion I had thought them to be. Jesus revealed to me the spiritual essence of these practices, not as a means of closeness to God, but as rituals that had become more about obedience and control than true, unconditional love for the Creator. I could see how the beauty of these practices had been distorted over time, how the intention behind them had been twisted, making them mere outward signs of piety rather than expressions of a deep, authentic relationship with God. It was deeply unsettling. I had spent my whole life following these practices, believing they were the foundation of my connection with God. And now I was seeing them through a lens of spiritual truth, one that showed me their limitations and the forces that had shaped them. What had once seemed like a path to salvation now appeared to be a path that led me away from the true heart of God's love. I was overwhelmed with a sense of loss, but also with a strange clarity. Jesus wasn't telling me that Islam was evil or wrong in its entirety, but that the essence of it, the core of its truth, had been corrupted by influences that diverted the message of love and salvation. I felt as though I had been trapped in a house of mirrors, where the reflection of God had been distorted, and now I was seeing the truth for the first time. The realization left me breathless, filled with a mixture of sorrow, confusion, and hope. It was as though I had been awakened to a new reality, a reality that required me to confront everything I had ever known and everything I had believed. And though it was painful, I knew that this revelation, however unsettling, was the first step toward understanding God's true love for me and for all of us. As I began to confront the deeper truths about my faith, the shift in my understanding didn't stop at the spiritual revelations I had received. It extended even to the most personal aspects of my religious practice, such as the hijab, a symbol of my devotion that, in that moment, seemed to take on a completely new meaning. For years, I wore the hijab with a sense of pride, believing it was a symbol of my obedience to God, a daily affirmation of my faith. It was more than just a piece of cloth. It was my shield, my connection to something sacred, a sign that I was living in accordance with the values I held dear. I had always thought of it as a protective covering, not just for modesty, but for spiritual purity, something that set me apart, reminding me of my devotion and piety. I believed it brought me closer to God, kept me on the right path, and signified my submission to His will. It was my identity, my outward expression of faith, a physical manifestation of my commitment to the teachings I had always followed. But that all changed in an instant, during the most unexpected of moments. As I stood there, in the presence of Jesus, everything I had once believed was suddenly called into question. It wasn't as though He condemned me for wearing the hijab, far from it. But as I stood in His light, I felt something shift inside me. It wasn't a voice that spoke, but a profound understanding that swept over me like a wave. The hijab, I realized, was not just a symbol of devotion. It had become a barrier, a veil that instead of bringing me closer to God, had kept me from seeing the truth that had been right in front of me all along. The hijab, which I had worn for so long as an expression of my faith, was no longer just a piece of cloth. It was a spiritual veil, one that separated me from the love and salvation that Jesus was offering. In that moment, I understood that my faith, as I had practiced it, was incomplete. It had been rooted in a system of rituals and obedience, but without the deeper understanding of God's love, it had left me yearning for something more, something I hadn't even known I needed. I had believed that the hijab protected my faith, but in truth, it had become a symbol of the distance I had placed between myself and the true path to salvation. This revelation was painful. The hijab, which had always felt like an essential part of who I was, now felt like something that had kept me trapped in a narrow understanding of God's will. It was as if I had been living behind a curtain, unable to see the full light of God's grace and mercy. because I had believed that following the rules was enough. But what Jesus showed me that day was that salvation was never about what I wore or the external markers of faith. It was about knowing Him, about embracing the love He offered freely, without any veil, physical or spiritual, standing between us. As I stood there reflecting on this, I realized that the hijab, in its original intent, was never meant to be a barrier, but somehow it had become one for me. It had symbolized obedience, yes, but not the deep, transformative relationship with God that Jesus was now offering. The veil had kept me from seeing the truth that salvation wasn't something to be earned through actions or appearances, but something freely given through faith in Jesus Christ. It wasn't about hiding behind a cloth. It was about uncovering my heart, laying it bare before God, and accepting His love in its purest, most unadulterated form. This realization deepened as I reflected on the years I had spent trying to earn salvation, only to discover that the truth was far simpler and far more freeing than I had ever imagined. The weight of the revelation hit me like a tidal wave. It wasn't just a fleeting thought or a vague understanding. It was a profound truth, one that shifted the very foundation of my beliefs. For years, I had followed the teachings of Islam, believing that salvation was something I had to earn, something I had to prove through my actions, my obedience, my rituals. I had been taught that salvation was distant, elusive, and tied to my adherence to the 5 pillars, to my devotion, to my efforts to please God. But as I stood there in the presence of Jesus, everything I had ever been taught was suddenly laid bare before me. I realized, with a clarity that left me breathless, that what I had been taught about salvation in Islam wasn't the truth at all. It was a lie designed to keep people like me trapped, to keep us from the freedom and grace that Jesus was offering. I had spent so much of my life trying to prove myself worthy, trying to earn my place in God's favor. Every act of worship, every prayer, every fast, every charity, these were all attempts to measure up, to gain approval, to secure my place in the afterlife. I thought that if I followed the rules, if I obeyed every command, then maybe, just maybe, I would be saved. But deep down, I always wondered if I was enough. Was I doing enough? Was I good enough? The fear of failure, of falling short, haunted me. It was a constant weight on my shoulders, this pressure to be perfect, to meet the standard of righteousness that Islam had set before me. But in that moment, standing in the presence of Jesus, I understood. His sacrifice, His pain, His suffering, His death on the cross wasn't just a story. It wasn't just a theological concept. It was the ultimate act of love, the ultimate gift of grace. I realized, with profound clarity, that salvation wasn't something I could ever earn. It was a gift given freely through Jesus' sacrifice to all who would accept it. No amount of prayer or fasting or charity could ever make me worthy of such a gift. It wasn't about my actions. It was about His love for me, His willingness to take on the weight of my sins so that I could be free. And that freedom was the salvation I had been searching for, the salvation I had never truly understood until now. What I had been taught about Islam, about salvation through deeds, through obedience, through striving, was a false path. It was a path that led me away from the truth, away from the love of God that was available to me right now, in this moment. Jesus showed me that salvation wasn't about what I could do, It was about what He had already done for me. I didn't need to earn it. I didn't need to prove myself. All I had to do was accept it, to receive His love and His grace, freely offered to anyone who believes. The truth was so simple, so beautiful, and yet I had spent my whole life searching for it in the wrong places. But now I finally saw it. In that moment of clarity, as the weight of God's grace washed over me, I felt a new responsibility stir within my heart, one that reached far beyond my own salvation. As I stood there, bathed in the light of God's love, something shifted deep inside of me. The world around me seemed to fade, and I could see clearly, more clearly than I had ever seen in my life. I saw my children. I saw their futures, their paths stretching out before them like two diverging roads, and I was gripped with a profound sense of urgency. I had spent so many years teaching them the faith that had been passed down to me, the faith that I had believed to be the only truth. But now, in the presence of Jesus, I saw two starkly different futures for them, and the weight of that realization almost took my breath away. In one vision, I saw my children walking the path I had always known, the path of Islam. They grew up just as I had, practicing the rituals, saying the prayers, giving the charity. They wore the hijab, fasted during Ramadan, and followed the teachings of the Quran as best they could. I saw their lives unfold, lives of good intentions, lives spent in service and devotion. And yet, there was a heaviness to their steps, a shadow that clung to them, one they couldn't shake off. In the afterlife, I saw them standing before God, their hearts filled with regret. They had followed the rules, done everything they were supposed to do, but it wasn't enough. They had missed the truth of salvation, the truth of grace that is found in Jesus alone. I could see it in their eyes, this deep, unshakable sorrow for what they had missed, for the love of God they had never truly known, because they had been taught that salvation was something to be earned, not freely given. It was a vision that broke my heart. I could feel the weight of their regrets, the burden of their efforts to be good enough, and I knew in that moment that it didn't have to be this way. But then, in the next breath, I saw another vision. This time, I saw my children walking a different path, one where they knew the truth of salvation through Jesus. Their hearts were light, filled with joy and peace, not because of anything they had done, but because they had accepted the grace and love that He offered so freely. I saw them embracing Jesus as their Savior, not as a distant figure, but as someone who walked with them every step of the way, guiding them, loving them, offering them a new life. In this vision, they were free, not bound by the weight of rituals or the pressure to be perfect. They had found the truth that salvation isn't something to be earned, but something to be received. And in receiving it, they were filled with the kind of love and peace that transcended everything else. Their futures were filled with hope, with purpose, and with the deep, unshakable assurance that they were loved by God, not because of their deeds, but because of Jesus' sacrifice for them. That vision brought tears to my eyes. I knew that this was the future I wanted for them, the future where they could experience the fullness of God's love, the future where they didn't have to live in fear or doubt, but could walk in the light of truth and grace. It was a vision that gave me hope, but it also filled me with a sense of urgency. I had to make a choice. I had to make sure they understood that salvation wasn't a matter of obedience or rituals, but of accepting the love of Jesus. I had to share with them the truth that I had found, the truth that had set me free. My love for them, my desire to protect them, now led me to this moment of decision. I couldn't let them continue down the path of uncertainty and regret. I had to guide them toward the path that would lead them to true peace, true freedom, and true salvation. In that moment, I understood my responsibility as a mother more than ever before. It wasn't enough to simply teach them the faith I had known. It was my duty to lead them to the truth, to show them the love of Christ that I had so recently discovered for myself. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to share with them the hope and freedom that comes only through Jesus. There was no time to waste, no time to let them stumble blindly down the wrong road. They needed to know, just as I had come to know, that salvation is not a distant promise to be earned, but a present gift to be received, and that gift was found in Jesus alone. And just as I had seen the path of truth for my children, I was now walking that path myself, a path that led me through death and back, to a truth so undeniable that even the greatest losses could not diminish it. I don't know how to explain it, but I came back. I was dead. For 15 minutes, I was gone. My heart had stopped, and the doctors had done all they could, but I wasn't coming back. That was it. I had no pulse, no breath, no signs of life. But somehow, against all odds, I returned. It's hard to put into words what happened during that time, what I saw or felt, because it was like nothing I had ever experienced. I was somewhere else, somewhere beyond this world, yet I knew deep down that it wasn't my time. There was a presence, something so pure, so filled with love and peace, that I felt entirely safe. It was Jesus. And when I woke up, the first thing I heard in my spirit was so simple, so clear, that it's burned into my soul forever. Jesus is Lord. I didn't know how to explain it to anyone, especially not to Omar. When I returned to the world of the living, I was disoriented, confused, and overwhelmed by everything I had just experienced. I was breathing again, my heart was beating again, but there was a shift inside me, a deep transformation. I knew something had changed, something fundamental about the way I saw life, about the way I understood God. And it wasn't the God I had always known in Islam. No, it was Jesus. He wasn't just a prophet or a good man, as I had been taught. He was the Lord. He was the Savior. And in that moment, I knew it with every fiber of my being. But when I tried to share this with Omar, I could feel the walls go up instantly. At first, he was confused. He couldn't understand why I was saying these things. He asked me, "Why are you talking about Jesus? What happened to the faith we shared? The faith that has been in your family for generations?" I could see the disbelief in his eyes, the confusion in his voice. It wasn't just that he didn't understand, it was that he couldn't comprehend how I could so radically change, so completely turn my back on the beliefs that had defined me and us our entire lives. But what he didn't know, what I didn't know how to say, was that I hadn't turned away from anything. I had found the truth, and that truth was Jesus. But the more I tried to explain, the more he pulled away. What had started as confusion turned to anger. He was angry with me, angry at the changes in me, angry at the fact that I had found something so new, so foreign to him, something that felt like a betrayal. Our discussions became heated. He told me that I was throwing away everything we had built together, Everything that had been part of our lives, our marriage, our family, it wasn't just about religion anymore. It was about trust. It was about everything I had known and everything he had known. And in his eyes, I had shattered that trust. I wanted to explain how real it all was, how real Jesus was to me. I wanted to tell him that I hadn't abandoned my faith. I had found the true meaning of it. But it was too late. The more I spoke, the more he rejected it, and the more he rejected me. It was as though I had become someone else, entirely. Someone he didn't know anymore. Someone he couldn't accept. The gap between us grew wider and wider, and in that space, I felt so alone. My heart ached for him, for the man I had once shared everything with, the father of our children, the man who had stood by my side for so long. But now, he looked at me with eyes full of anger, full of confusion. I wasn't the woman he had married anymore. I wasn't the person he had built his life with. It was one of the hardest things I've ever faced, to feel that rejection from the one person who should have understood me the most. To know that the truth I had found was causing this rift between us, and to feel that I had no choice but to walk in that truth, no matter how painful it was. There were nights I cried, feeling utterly isolated, feeling like I had lost everything. I was still me, but I was different, and I didn't know how to bridge that gap between the woman I had been and the woman I had become in Jesus. And yet, the message he gave me, the truth that Jesus is Lord, was clearer than anything I had ever known. It was the only truth that mattered. In those moments of deep sorrow and loneliness, I clung to that truth because it was the only thing that was real, the only thing that had brought me back to life. Even if it meant losing everything I had known, I couldn't deny the reality of Jesus in my life. I had returned from death for a reason, and that reason was to carry his message. Jesus is Lord. I had to hold on to that, no matter what, even if it meant walking a road of isolation and rejection. Because in the end, I knew that he was the truth, and nothing, no rejection, no anger, no misunderstanding could take that away from me. Despite the rejection and isolation I faced from those I loved, there was a flicker of hope in my heart, a desire to find a place where I could be accepted, where I could live out my faith without fear. It felt like the world was closing in on me. After everything, after my return to life, after the overwhelming truth I had experienced in Christ, there was only rejection waiting for me. Omar had turned away from me. Our home was filled with tension, and the once comforting embrace of my family had become a place of accusation and confusion. Every day, I felt the weight of isolation, the sting of being cut off from the people I had once called my own. They didn't understand me anymore, didn't understand what had happened to me. To them, I was lost, and worse, I had lost my way. I had abandoned the faith that had been woven into the fabric of my life, and there was no going back. But no matter how much they rejected me, no matter how many times I was pushed away, I knew one thing for sure. I couldn't deny the truth of Jesus. In those lonely days, I found myself searching for something, anything, that would bring me peace, a place where I could be myself, where I could freely live out this new faith without fear of rejection. I didn't know where to turn. I felt like an outsider in my own life. But deep down, I knew I had to find a way to hold on to the love I had experienced, the peace I had found in Christ, even if it meant stepping away from everything I had ever known. Then, one day, in the midst of my struggle, I heard a whisper, small but unmistakable. Someone had told me about a secret church, a hidden community of believers who, like me, had experienced the rejection and pain of walking away from the faith they had once known. A church that had been forced into the shadows, a place where people who shared the love of Jesus could gather without fear of persecution. I didn't know if I could trust it. I didn't know if this would be another place of disappointment, another door slammed in my face. But something in my heart told me I had to try. The day I walked into that small, secret gathering, something shifted inside of me. The moment I stepped through that door, I was met with a warmth, a peace, unlike anything I had known. The walls were humble, the space simple, but it didn't matter. It felt like home. I was surrounded by people who didn't judge me, who didn't look at me with suspicion or fear. They didn't question why I was there. They just opened their arms to me as if they had known me for years. It was as though Jesus himself was there, in the midst of his people, offering me the love I had so desperately longed for. I can't explain the peace that filled me in that moment. It was a peace that washed over me like a gentle wave, erasing the anxiety and sorrow that had taken root in my heart. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt like I belonged. I wasn't an outsider anymore. I wasn't alone. I was part of something beautiful, something real. I was part of the body of Christ. In that hidden church, I found a family, one that didn't care about my past, about the mistakes I had made, or the traditions I had left behind. They didn't see me as a project to fix or a soul to save. They saw me as I was, a woman who had experienced the love of Jesus and was trying to live out that love in a world that didn't understand. We prayed together, we sang together, and we shared our stories of faith, of struggle, and of transformation. We built each other up, encouraged each other, and most of all, we loved each other. I had finally found the peace I had been searching for, the peace that comes from knowing I am loved and accepted, not because of anything I have done, but because of Jesus. The more I spent time with this new family, the more I realized how deeply I had been starved for real, authentic community. We weren't perfect. None of us were. We were broken people, but we were united in one thing: the love of Christ. I was no longer isolated. I was no longer rejected. I was no longer alone. I was part of something that was bigger than myself, a body of believers who had experienced the same rejection, the same pain, but who had also experienced the same love and grace of God. The threats and the fear of persecution didn't disappear, of course. I still had to be careful, still had to hide my faith in public. But in that secret church, I found the strength to stand firm in my belief, to walk in the freedom that Jesus had given me. The world outside might have been filled with rejection and fear, but within those walls, I found peace. I found love, and I found a family. And that, in the end, was all that I needed. If you are also looking for peace and protection in your life, do not hesitate to open your heart and call on God. Let Him come into your life and guide you through every difficulty. God is our salvation, where we find hope that never fails. I invite you to share your thoughts and join me in praying for God's peace and protection to be with each of us. Do not let fear or trial make you feel alone, for God is always near, ready to protect and bless us. Together, we will experience His great love.